everybody. My name is Peter Guattery. I'm an employment and labor attorney at Whiteford, Taylor & Preston. I'm located in Baltimore, Maryland. I've had many questions coming into the firm about vaccinations in this era of COVID-19, and thought that a quick trip through some helpful tips for employers to navigate this landscape would be in order. So I'm going to run through these quickly, and I'm sure that you'll find some of it of interest and give you something to think about as you go about implementing your own policies. Right now, we're seeing lights at the end of the pandemic tunnel. We have 3 promising vaccines so far, Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. 2 of them have sought expedited review by the FDA, which means that we might start seeing vaccinations coming out in early or mid-December. Right now, the CDC is planning to meet to determine the prioritization of vaccinations, which generally means that you're probably going to see these going to healthcare workers, first responders, and persons at severe risk of COVID before they're going to be coming out to the general public. However, all reported information so far suggests a timetable that general vaccination availability will be in spring of 2021, which, having been in the last 8 to 9 months sitting at home, is good news. So now employers are looking at, should we mandate a vaccine or not mandate a vaccine? Just at the outset, I'll note that the EEOC has suggested that mandating a vaccine may not be the best overall operational policy, but a number of employers have looked at this, and particularly with the concerns of COVID, and raised the question. So before any policy is put into place mandating a vaccine, you need to look at a number of factors. Number 1, what is the business need for vaccinations? Dual risk assessment, the availability of other effective measures for infection control. You're going to have to look at reasonable accommodation issues. Many businesses probably can operate without the need for a vaccine, or with just encouraging employees to vaccine or giving them incentives to vaccine rather than implementing a policy which requires them. Employers who mandate vaccines are also going to have to be aware that there are certain legal ramifications from a vaccine mandate. That would include the need to accommodate persons who have disabilities or who have religious objections, which require accommodation. Also, if you're a unionized employer, you may have an obligation to bargain collectively about the implementation of a vaccine mandate. Another factor to consider is your workforce culture and how that might affect the implementation of a policy or affect employee morale. There is not quite an overwhelming reliance on the efficacy or desire to take the vaccine at this point in time, although that may change, and polling has shown the desire to take the vaccine has increased. However, there is an overall general distrust of vaccines that is out there, and employees may doubt it. And depending on your particular workforce and where they get their news and what news they follow, you may find that you have morale issues you need to deal with. What measures will the company take to enforce the policy? If you're going to terminate somebody for not taking the vaccine, then you're going to have to follow through. If you're not prepared to take that step, then maybe a mandate isn't for you. How will you pay for the vaccine? Preliminarily, it appears it may be provided cost-free by the government, but that may change depending on costs, particularly on how these tests or how these vaccines may be required to be administered, some requiring 2 doses. How will that be done? What proof of vaccine will you require? And then finally, what privacy protocols will be implemented? You have to maintain certain medical information regarding employees separate files per the ADA. You'll have to maintain certain employee information protected under HIPAA, and information regarding employee vaccination or non-vaccination would fall within this category. And you need to develop procedures and protocols to address those concerns before you mandate employees taking vaccines. I want to talk a little bit about reasonable accommodation. The Americans with Disability Act was covered in guidance issued by the EEOC, in which they posed a question. May an employer covered by the ADA and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act compel all of its employees to take the influenza vaccine, regardless of their medical conditions or religious beliefs? The answer is no. Employees can have an exemption from a mandatory vaccination requirement based on an ADA disability that prevents them from taking the vaccine. The only way you would not be able to accommodate that is if there was an undue hardship, that is significant difficulty or expense on the part of the employer. Generally, ADA-covered employers, as these EOC recommended, should simply encourage employees to get the vaccine rather than requiring them to take it. Another consideration relates to pregnancy. Pregnant employee may not necessarily be disabled, but certain impairments resulting from pregnancy may qualify as a disability under the ADA. Some states have expanded legal protections for pregnant employees to require reasonable accommodation for them in order to perform their job, and this includes the state of Maryland. I also draw your attention to some legal decisions in which it was determined that a nurse who was pregnant was permitted not to, or was provided a reasonable accommodation not to work around patients who were HIV positive at a time until such time that it no longer presented a risk to her pregnancy. Religious accommodation is a slightly different animal than ADA accommodation, and that's because the standard for undue hardship is somewhat less. With religious accommodation, it has to be more than a de minimis cost to the employer's business, which is a lower burden to hurdle, to cross over. However, an employee's sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance may prevent him from taking the vaccine, and in that case, the employer would have to provide a reasonable accommodation. Be aware that Title VII defines religion very broadly to include not only traditional organized religions, but also religious beliefs that are new, uncommon, not part of a formal church or sect, or only subscribed to by a small number of people. A recent case out of the Fourth Circuit addressed whether veganism, i.e. an employee who was a devout vegan, qualified for a religious exemption, and the finding was that she did. When you're looking at reasonable accommodation requests, each one is taken on its own terms. Assess the facts relating to the employee's request. Seek clarification if needed. Don't make an assumption. Get the facts. You're going to need that to engage in an interactive process with the employee in order to determine possible accommodations and obtain necessary information for determining what accommodations are possible, what present an undue burden, or simply not feasible. You'll need to review and balance potential accommodations. There are, for people who may not take a vaccine, accommodations such as the use of protective gear, transfer a different position, etc. And another factor to consider in this process is an assessment of risks. If the person doesn't take the vaccine, what are the risks and what mitigation measures can be put in place to reduce that risk? Many employers are already operating without a vaccine with minimal risk to employees due to mitigation measures already in place. Measures required in lieu of vaccination could be, if you want to go take a look at the Centers for Disease Control website, where they provide detailed recommendations for specific workplaces depending on the nature of the particular risk of infection at that workplace. It is the best place to start in assessing your workplace risk and determining what types of measures are recommended by the CDC. Note that this guidance changes periodically, and it's best to keep up to date on it as best as possible. OSHA has effectively adopted CDC guidance. As an employer, you're obligated to maintain a safe workplace for your employees, even if there's no specific OSHA standard which applies. For OSHA, a standard is a specific regulation which defines a particular safety practice. In most situations involving COVID, the only applicable standard is the general duty standard to provide a safe workplace, not the PPE standard, which people often mistakenly correlate to wearing a simple paper or cloth mask. Those are not PPE. The PPE standard relates more to respirators and other protective equipment in much more clinical or industrial settings. Possible accommodations may include receiving alternate vaccine formulations. It may be that a person's disability is affected only by one of the several vaccines which are out there. The wearing of additional protective gear, moving work locations so that employees are not in a position where they might present a risk to persons entering the premises or working there, working remotely, a temporary leave of absence until the pandemic is under control by using herd immunity through the vaccine, not otherwise, or reassignment to a position with less risk of exposure or infection. These are, of course, very few examples. There may be others which may come about in your practice. In all cases, a written policy that addresses what your vaccination policy will be is important. It's also important to understand your industry and the potential risks and impact on your workforce of COVID-19 and vaccination policies. At some point, we'll be through all of this. You'll have a substantial number of persons who are vaccinated, so it will not be an issue. However, for the time being, these are your immediate concerns, and I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you.